Chapter 12. Attacks on merchant caravans along Aramid River. Highwaymen apprehended. No connection to Thalus or followers. Suspected brigand camp tucked away in the marshlands of eastern Hrim. Abandoned. No sign of those who slither in the dark. Network of caves in the southern valley of the Ogma Mountains. No signs of activity. Demonic beast roars in the sealed forest. Possible outpost location? Nothing. Suspicious activity along the mountain range near Fodlan's Throat? No. Rumors of smuggler ships transporting unknown magical apparatus? No. No. Nothing! Hubert swiped away the stacks of scribbled parchment and annotated maps from his desk with an enraged roar. The paper swirled through the air in a cyclone of ink-stained parchment before crumpling to the ground in a messy heap alongside the scrunched-up balls of previously discarded reports and documents. A couple stray sheets clung stubbornly to the desk, his ink and quill pot knocked aside, thin black streams pouring from the latter. Hubert slumped over the desk, his face buried in his arms. Tremors quaked his shoulders and rolled down his limbs. Lightning currents of adrenaline ripped through his veins, battling hitches as the never-ending maelstrom that had consumed his thoughts for days continued to lacerate the insides of his skull. His body screamed at him to rest, but he could not stop. Not now. It had been a week since Ferdinand and Sylvain were abducted. A week since Hubert had more or less abandoned every one of his duties and dedicated every waking second of the day to locating the two missing Imperial generals. A week since Hubert's investigations had failed to turn up even a single clue as to where his dear companions had been taken. The march into Fargus had been postponed. The abduction of two high-ranking generals, including one with intimate knowledge of the northern regions of the kingdom and understood the inner workings of Dimitri's army, were far too great a loss, too great a risk for the army to dive into the heart of enemy territory, whilst the whereabouts of two of its most renowned commanding officers remained unknown. Entire battalions would be lost without their guidance, and morale in the army had plummeted with the disappearance of two of their most charismatic generals. Hubert took a shaky gulp of air, forcing the shaking in his hands to go still, the cold oak of his desk pressed against his forehead. Over and over, the events of the day played in his head, waking up in a cave to Sylvain's nonsensical plan of a fake kidnapping unexpectedly and, horrifyingly, escalating into a real one. The anguish in Ferdinand's face when he had thought he was being made a fool, the vitriol in his voice, more scalding to Hubert than any acid, as he spat out his confession of love in a heart-wrenching snarl seconds before he stormed off. Now Hubert, enraged, had snapped at Sylvain for his buffoonish idea. The Fargus paladin then racing after Ferdinand, desperate to put things right. Hubert himself sprinting through the gnarl of dark tunnels, briefly catching sight of the bickering knights, before being spirited away by the spectral fiends lurking in the shadows. The two men dragged into the darkness as Hubert cried out in vain. A shuddering breath tangled with a choked whimper clawed at Hubert's throat. He tugged at his hair and shoved down the urge to scream. He thought of all the things he could have done differently, been more forceful when demanding Sylvain end the farcical kidnapping charade, snuff it out before Ferdinand could arrive, and remove the reason for the man to run off, properly express his feelings for Ferdinand, rather than gaping and blabbering like a fish with its brains scooped out. Been faster as he raced through the caves, reaching the paladins before Thalus's wretched ilk could arrive. Reacted more quickly when the foul vermin arrived and eliminate them before they could attack. Hubert gritted his teeth and hammered his closed fist against the desk. He should have seen it coming. The attempted abduction of Lady Penelope and Baramas had failed. Myson, Thalus's second-in-command, killed in the process. There was no way foiling Thalus's plans in such a manner would pass without some form of retribution. Hubert cursed himself for not doing more, for allowing himself to slip into complacency as they scrambled to prepare for their march into the kingdom. Finding the missing paladins had become their top priority, with Hubert tasked with leading the search. Lady Edelgard had sent out countless scouts, on top of Hubert's own agents, to comb the surrounding area for any sign of the paladins. Nothing could be found. Hubert scoured his notes again and again, retracing the steps of those who slithered in the dark, all of their appearances, and all sites of their activities, but to no avail. Even Arundel's loathsome presence had been conspicuously absent from the monastery. Out of desperation, Hubert had even dug through the small chest of notes his mother had entrusted to him that held his father's research, but the scribbled ramblings were just as nonsensical now as they had been when he first perused them back at the cottage. Once again, he had been drawn to a strange dream of sharpened squiggles. Once again, he had been drawn to the strange diagram of sharpened squiggles, the jagged peaks similar to a child's illustration of an ocean's waves. Once again, the picture revealed nothing. There was no discernible pattern to the rows of sharp crests, no hidden message that could be unearthed. Yet another dead end. Every day, hour, minute, even second that passed lowered the chances of finding Ferdinand and Sylvain alive and well. Hubert chewed at his bottom lip, biting back another whimper that threatened to warble past his lips. The brick, pressing at his chest, sharpened its claws and latched into Hubert's heart and squeezed. Everything felt dimmer with the absence of the two paladins. A foolish sentiment, but not one Hubert could ignore. He thought of Ferdinand, how close the two of them had grown over the course of the war. Once bitter rivals, the two had become nearly inseparable, both on the battlefield and during their shared times together during quieter moments. Despite his gregarious nature, Ferdinand had opened up to Hubert about his doubts, his fears, in a way he was with no other. Ferdinand was the first person Hubert had ever felt romantic feelings for, and impossibly, Ferdinand had felt the same way towards him, a revelation that had been shouted with rage at Hubert, instead of lovingly whispered, all because Hubert had been unable to string together the words himself. A sniffle tickled his nose. His fingers clenched and clawed at the table. Messengers had been sent days ago to the Vestra cottage to alert Lady Penelope of her son's missing status. He could not even begin to imagine the heartbreak Lady Penelope must have felt upon hearing the news. Hubert had promised her he would look out for Ferdinand, and he had failed miserably. Hubert also thought of his unexpected friendship with Sylvain, the unintended result of an arrangement Hubert had barely agreed to. And yet, the Fargus paladin had shown his capabilities through his magical aptitude and his surprisingly cunning mind, and although many of his courting ideas left much to be desired, Sylvain had earned his trust and become one of his most treasured companions. He thought of the knight's enthusiasm, their shared joy, as the fire orb they had worked on together fully sprung to life. A sharp pain tied Hubert's innards in a knot as he thought of the last words he had snapped at the paladin. He had cursed at the man, rejecting their newly forged friendship, as Hubert snarled that he hoped he would never see Sylvain again. A wish that, if his investigation did not unearth a miraculous breakthrough soon, would become horrifyingly true. Another shaky breath rattled his chest. Hubert clenched and unclenched his fists, but still the tremors would not stop. Even if Ferdinand and Sylvain did live, there was no saying what condition the two paladins would be in. Both bore crests, which granted them better chances at survival. However, those very same crests also made them ripe for the fiend's nefarious experiment. Icy vines of terror wrapped around Hubert's lungs, like the coiled body of a boa constrictor. Images flashed through his mind of Edelgard's brother, who Hubert had stumbled upon in the bowels of Enbar Palace, the young man reduced to a snarling beast that writhed, mindless and frenzied, in its chains. More memories seeped like ice water into his thoughts, this time of a willowy, terrified girl, frail from her imprisonment and quaking with terror, her hair stripped of color, tapestries of scars painted over her skin, and staring at Hubert with frightened eyes that held no recognition of him. It had taken months of consistent companionship to return even a fragment of the memories of their shared childhood. Hubert pinched the bridge of his nose and growled. The thoughts would not stay still. They swirled and shrieked, the bladed words of a hurricane inside his skull. Sleep had been sparse the past week, an hour here or there, from when his body finally collapsed from exhaustion. What should have been moments of respite quickly turned into a bubbling cauldron that swirled together every nightmarish, worst scenario Hubert's mind had concocted. In his dreams, it was Ferdinand, emaciated and riddled with scars, who crawled from the dungeons, flaming ringlets of copper hair, bleached a bone white, and hanging lanky over his gaunt face, as he asked who Hubert was. In his dreams, it was Sylvain, who snapped and snarled from his chains, scaled spines growing out of his back, half his face partially transformed into a draconic maw of jagged teeth. Hubert would wake from the dreams with a strangled cry, sweat coating every inch of his skin, his heart threatening to burst from the confines of his rib cage. Relief that the visions were mere dreams were always short-lived. While Ferdinand and Sylvain remained captured, there was nothing stopping those horrific dreams from becoming reality. Hubert squeezed his eyes shut, refusing to let the droplets fall. A hitch in his breathing clogged his throat, the weight of a masonry block heavy against his chest and pressed at his heart and lungs. Pressure burned at the backs of his eyes, and stinging pools of saline burned his vision, the sclera of his eyes most definitely with reddened, bloodshot branches. A knock at the door drew his attention. Hubert sniffled and wiped his eyes. He stood up, smoothing out the wrinkles of his rumpled, ink-stained tunic, and barked at his guest. "Enter!" The door opened just enough for Shamir to slip inside, the sniper closing her door with a light click. She padded across the room in cautious, near-soundless steps, her face grim. "I don't suppose our lead in Gaspard territory amounted to anything?" Hubert asked in a tight voice. He already knew what the answer would be. "I'm afraid not. Just regular brigands attacking villagers along the border. They've been dealt with," she responded bluntly, a flicker of sympathy softening her sharp features. Hubert sighed, slumping over his desk once more. It was a long shot, but one of his agents had heard a rumor of reoccurring attacks in Gaspard territory. There had been little to suggest that it had anything to do with those who slither in the dark, but at this point Hubert was out of leads and clinging to whatever thin threads he could latch his hands onto. "And any word from Yuri concerning the information the black market merchants unearthed?" Hubert asked. He hoped Shamir did not notice the way his voice cracked, brittle, like aged porcelain, that would shatter at the slightest touch. Ever since the fake kidnapping incident, most of the Ashen Wolves had been carefully avoiding Hubert, flashes of guilt sweeping across their faces the rare times they had crossed paths with him. Yuri had been the exception, throwing himself into the search for their missing companions almost as much as Hubert himself. "I received a message from him not too long ago, though it doesn't sound like he was able to unearth anything we didn't already know," Shamir continued in a solemn tone and a slight grimace. She pulled a rolled-up sheet of parchment from the inside of her coat. Hubert peeled himself away from the desk and nodded to her with a heavy sigh. Shamir approached in 2 quick strides. She unraveled the scroll to reveal another map, this one detailing the topography of the Ogma Mountains, and spread it across the desk. According to Yuri, his contact in the black market sold several items of interest to some brigands situated in the forests surrounding the Ogma Mountains, multiple crates of arcane crystals, armored hides harvested from giant crawlers, and at least 3 stolen crest stones. The exchange place took here. Sylvain pointed to a section of the map that was painted green and etched with tree symbols. "They had a camp not far from—" Yes, we've already investigated that camp," Hubert growled, recognizing the indicated spot to be very near the same bandit camp that he and Sylvain had investigated months ago. Shamir silently watched him with a sympathetic frown. The silence hung heavy between them, until Hubert spoke with a heavy sigh. "Thank you for your report, Shamir. That will be all." Hubert remained hunched over the desk, a swath of dark curls falling over and concealing his face. The sensation of burning and pressure returned to his eyes. Shamir made no move to leave the room. Hubert could feel her intense gaze boring into him. "You should get some rest," her words more an order than a suggestion. "You won't do Ferdinand and Sylvain any good if you collapse from exhaustion again." "Is that a command from Lady Edelgard? Or yourself?" he muttered. "Both," she said sharply. She crossed her arms and narrowed her eyes at the empty cup ringed with dark stains and a smoky, acidic scent clinging to the porcelain. And no more coffee. Drink some actual water. Eat a normal meal. And get some sleep. I know exactly where your coffee beans are stashed, and have no problem hiding them from you. The beginnings of a growl coiled over his gritted teeth. Hubert clenched his fists and bit back the urge to snap back at her. Over the course of the week, despite being mired in their own duties, a parade of his companions had approached him to check on his well-being. Nearly every day, Bernadetta and Ash would softly knock on his door and leave a plate of warm food for him, with a quiet reminder that he needed to eat something. A waste, Hubert thought, seeing as he usually left the food untouched, only removing it from the hallway to ensure the unattended meal did not attract rodents. Others, Dorothea, Petra, Ignaz, Ingrid, had been more direct in their approach, asking how he was feeling, and offering a sympathetic ear. Hubert had brushed off their words of concern with a clipped remark before returning to his search. 3 days ago, Edelgard, Caspar, and Linhart had cornered him once they realized he was not getting any sleep. The healer had brewed a sleeping draught to help him rest, a potion that was quickly abandoned once Hubert realized the draught only made the nightmares even worse. Shamir had been no exception to the entourage of worried Mother Henning Hubert had been subjected to. The sniper continued to regard him with a critical eye as she awaited his response. Without a doubt, she would likely haul him to the infirmary if his lapse in self-care was about to put his health in danger. It would not be the first time she had done so. A hollow chuckle rumbled Hubert's chest. He pushed himself into a standing position, staggering slightly as his head spun. The answer to Shemaine's inquiry sputtered to a halt as his gaze drifted to the topographical map beneath him. Hubert frowned as he stared at the map of the Ogma Mountains, the sharpened peaks jabbing at the sky like rows of shark teeth, especially noticeable from the upside-down angle from which he stared at the map. He tilted his head to the side and blinked at the page, the pointed edges weirdly familiar in their arrangement, a pattern that scratched at the back of Hubert's mind. Suddenly, the memory of where he had seen such a formation, uneven rows of triangular-shaped, haphazardly scribbled atop one another, flashed through his mind. Hubert's eyes went wide, and his jaw dropped as realization clicked into place. No. It couldn't be. He dove for the ground and began scrounging through the mound of papers he had knocked from his desk. Shamir hovered behind him with a slight frown and a confused furrow in her brow. Hubert tore through the pages, the ink staining his hands, tossing aside the unwanted sheets with a frustrated growl. Finally, the page he searched for fell into his hands. He clambered to his feet, the page shaking in his grasp. His eyes darted between the map on his desk and the mad scrawls detailed on the crinkled, aged parchment clutched between his fingers. The strange drawing that he had found among his father's notes that Hubert had been unable to make any sense of. Had the loathsome wretch actually been able to unearth something of value before his death? Swallowing past the syrupy lump in his throat, Hubert's gaze darted to the map and the sheet of parchment in his hand. Perhaps it was merely a byproduct of his fatigue-addled mind, or desperation forming patterns in his mind where none actually existed. But Hubert was beyond certain that the messy, gnarled, knife-like scribbles were a near-perfect match to the portion of sharp mountain peaks staring at him from the map. "Shamir, take a look at this drawing." Hubert placed the drawing just above the mountain range etched on the map, and pointed to the pattern of hastily scrawled, triangular shapes. "The arrangement of these sharp points, do they not resemble the formation of the mountain peaks along the eastern ridge?" The sniper leaned in close, her eyes narrowed, her mouth pressed into a thin line. "It's hard to say for certain. There's not a lot of detail in that drawing," she hummed. "Still, there's definitely some similarities. That location isn't far from here. It may be worth checking out." Hubert's shoulders stooped as another sigh racked his body. He gnawed at his bottom lip until he tasted copper. The odds were far from favorable, hedging their odds on finding Ferdinand and Sylvain on the unhinged scribbles of one of the people Hubert loathed most. It was a fool's glimmer of hope, so faint against the shroud of impossibility and doubt, likely to end in nothing more than dismal failure. But they were out of options, and they were running out of time. Hubert swallowed heavily, heart hammering in his chest. His eyes remained locked onto the image of the mountain range. He nodded to Shamir, and made plans to depart from the monastery immediately. The meeting was about to begin. They were all assembled in the cardinal's room, as was usual for their war council meetings. Hubert stood at the head of the table. A topographical map of the Ogma Mountains he and Shamir had been examining earlier spread across the table, accompanied by several hastily scrawled notes that had been recently added. Long fingers drummed against the table in a frenetic patter as he waited for everyone to take their seats. Right under his nose. The wretched vermin had been right under his nose the entire blasted time. Relief and anger had slammed into him like the crashing waves of a typhoon when he and Shamir had raced to the noted spot on the map and confirmed Hubert's suspicions of the hidden base. It had taken some time to find the trails that wound through the forest, a labyrinth of sprawling, hoof-beaten paths that hugged the base of the mountains. Eventually, a glint of light sparkled in the corner of Hubert's eye and drew his attention as he frantically guided his horse along the forest trails. Tucked in a dark thicket of woven pine branches and snug against the rocky face of the mountain was the glistening sheen of some sort of energy barrier, a bubble of electrified shimmering iridescence that was nearly impossible to see with the naked eye, the faintest glow of jewel tones reflecting against its surface as it refractured the sunlight. Even Hubert's innate ability to sense magic had failed to detect the barrier. They tested the barrier, first with a miasma spell and an arrow launched at the shimmering wall, the attacks passing through undeterred and slamming into the rock face on the other side. A stick had been used next, Hubert holding up the branch and pressing it through the translucent shield to examine the barrier's effect on organic tissue. The stick passed through unmarred. Not a single scratch or burn seared against the wood. Hesitantly, Hubert lifted his hand and touched the fingertips to the faint, glowing wall before him. The light tingled, a tickling sensation that brushed against his fingers in a way not dissimilar to static gathered on wool, but left his hand unscathed. A ward of some sort, likely one to prevent one from warping, but none like any Hubert had ever encountered before. The traces of magic clinging to the veil of glittering energy, unfamiliar and beyond explanation. The barrier was likely conjured by an artifact of the old world, before the Church of Saros, scrounged from ruins of a dead civilization by those who slither in the dark, and repurposed for their nefarious means. Hubert had already been aware of other pieces of ancient technology that had been unearthed, mechanical viscum turrets, the rumors of the steel golems Cornelia had cobbled together, and would not be surprised if the barrier was another apparatus lost to time. On the other side of the barrier lay a cluster of glyphs, many of them obscured by the blades of long grass. It was difficult to confirm with complete certainty, but even camouflaged by the surrounding brush, Hubert could see the familiar pattern of an ancient teleportation gate. The sigils were dull and lifeless, but arranged into a circle. Hubert knelt beside the markings, tracing his gloved fingers along the strange, cold metal they were etched into. "Think this is the entrance to their base?" Shamir had asked, as she crouched down beside Hubert to examine the markings. "Without a doubt." Hubert had frowned. A bubble of frustration gurgled into his chest, and his teeth clenched and gnashed as he poked at the markings that remained stubbornly dim. They were so close, yet with no way to enter the base, the hideout might as well have been on another continent. He and Shamir had returned to the monastery and discussed their findings with Lady Edelgard and the professor. After sending more scouts to search the area further, they drafted a plan to determine the best course of action of how to infiltrate the mountain base. In the cardinal's room, Lady Edelgard sat at Hubert's right, the professor at his left. Dorothea, Petra, Bernadetta, Caspar, Linhart, and Shamir were all in attendance as well, taking their seats with a low, buzzing hum of chatter, their eyes turned to Hubert, varying levels of anxious worry painted across their faces. Once everyone was seated and waiting, Hubert began, I thank you for all assembling here on such short notice. He started in a grim tone. We have reason to believe that those responsible for abducting Generals Eyre and Gautier may have been situated at the highest peaks along the eastern ridge of the Ogma Mountains, near the Adrestia-Leicester border. With any luck, we'll find our missing generals being held there. Hubert tapped the map and pointed to the circled cluster of mountain peaks on the map. Everyone at the table leaned over in their seats to get a closer look at the parchment.
Wait! Those scary mages have been that close this whole time?
Bernadette squeaked, as her face paled to a peculiar shade of grey. Although himself, Lady Edelgard, and the professor were the only ones in the room who knew the full extent of what had been uncovered concerning those who slither in the dark, Ferdinand and Sylvain's abduction had forced them to disclose information about the loathsome cabal to their fellow Black Eagle classmates, revealing enough information to properly inform their allies as to the threat they faced, without stirring up a panic, had been a careful balancing act. Tensions within the Imperial Army since Ferdinand and Sylvain's capture were tumultuous enough already. The last thing they needed was for half the soldiers to start jumping at every shadow or attacking each other under the misguided belief that someone was a hidden face-stealer. Or worse, provoking Thalys into undergoing more harsh measures of retribution, measures that could quickly result in the deaths of the hostages trapped in their clutches. Although it pains me to admit that these fiends were able to remain undetected for so long whilst lurking so close to the monastery, rest assured they will be dealt with in a swift and thorough manner, Hubert declared, with a low growl curling his voice. Not a single one of those wretches will remain once we sweep through their base. Bernadetta let out a sigh of relief at Hubert's confident words, a fraction of colour returning to her cheeks. Hubert then pointed to a smaller circle at the base of the mountains, the location of the deactivated teleportation gate he and Shamir had discovered. Our greatest obstacle lies with the protective barrier they have surrounding the base, Hubert continued, with a thread of uneasiness woven through his words. With it still in place, we will not be able to warp any soldiers inside. Furthermore, the ground-level entrance appears to be a teleportation gate that will only activate on their command, likely operated by some sort of apparatus inside the base. So how are we supposed to burst inside and rescue our friends if we can't even get past the front door? Caspar hollered. He enthusiastically jumped to his feet as he yelled, only to be hauled back into his chair by Linhart, tugging at his arm. There is another way into their base, Hubert said with a slight grimace. Petra, as well as several other wyvern riders, were able to locate a secondary entrance near this mountain's peak. Hubert pointed to another small circle on the map, this one looped around the pointed tip of a mountain in the center of the circled cluster. Unfortunately, the entrance is heavily guarded with turrets, Hubert said, his words solemn. We sustained multiple casualties from our flying units while scouting that area. Extreme caution will need to be taken if we are to bypass their defenses with minimal losses. A small contingent of Pegasus Knights and Wyvern Riders had been sent to that cluster of mountains to search the area for other possible entrances into the hidden base. Although their search had borne fruit, having located a small egress tucked away in an alcove not far from the summit of one of the central mountains, the unexpected assault of magic-woven projectiles had ripped through most of their airborne scouts, with 2 dead and 2 others in the infirmary with grievous injuries. Petra and her wyvern had managed to escape mostly unscathed, but were forced to retreat. Now, as to our plan for disabling their defenses. Hubert's words came to an abrupt halt as a clamor of familiar voices yelling sounded from just outside the cardinal's room, a man and a woman arguing with the soldiers standing guard just outside the war council chambers, the angry shouts muffled by the thick walls. A small smile quirked to the corners of Hubert's mouth as he recognized who the voices belonged to. "Would you mind inviting our guests inside?" he asked one of the guards, standing at the edge of the room. The guard nodded, and did as requested. Immediately, Ingrid stormed into the room and stalked right towards Hubert, waves of fury rolling off her like steam from a bubbling cauldron. Felix trailed close behind, his anger of a colder variety, but no less incensed. Both Fargan knights were garbed in their armor and ready for battle, their respective heroes' relics strapped to their backs. They stared down at him, embers glowing in their eyes, their faces set with steel-like resolve. "If you're setting out to rescue Sylvain and Ferdinand, then we're coming too," Ingrid demanded. "I understand your concern, but we need to approach this matter delicately," Lady Edelgard said with a sympathetic frown. "This could all very well be a trap to lure more of our high-ranking officers. We can't risk sending too many of our generals." "You can't honestly expect us to wait around here and do nothing," Felix hissed. "Sylvain is our friend," Ingrid cried. "There's no way we're sitting this mission out." "We're joining you on this mission. End of discussion," Felix added firmly. He crossed his arms and aimed a stubborn glare at Hubert. "Very well," Hubert said with a tiny but warm smile. "Actually, Ingrid, your inclusion in this mission will serve quite well. The base in question is buried in the Ogma Mountains, with the only means of entrance located near the summit. Multiple airborne units will be needed to properly infiltrate the base. I believe your skills as a Falcon Knight will be most beneficial." "And you're certain this is where Sylvain and Ferdinand are?" Ingrid frowned, the fire that had been burning across her face cooling as a wave of unease washed across her features. Hubert grimaced, doubt sliced against his chest like a serrated, rust-coated blade. "I unfortunately cannot provide you a guarantee that this is where they are being held," he sighed, "but at this time it is the best lead that we have." Ingrid's face remained pinched and troubled, but she nodded tightly at Hubert and spoke in a firm voice. "In that case, just give the order, and I'll do what's needed." "Excellent." Hubert nodded. Relief slipped over Ingrid and Felix's faces as they took their seats at the table as well. Hubert directed his attention to the map once more and plucked his quill from the inkwell at his side. "Now, we will require 4 airborne units in order for this plan to work. 2 will work as decoys to draw the fire of the Viscum turrets." Hubert scratched 2 X's on the map, just north of the mountains, along with some looping arrows around the dots representing the turret locations that had been identified, while the other 2 head for the entrance and make their way to the entrance and slip inside the base. 2 additional X's were scribbled next to a mountain crest west of the hidden entrance, accompanied by sweeping arrows pointed to the direction they were to go. "Once inside," Hubert continued, "the infiltration team will need to locate 2 magical apparatuses, one to disable the anti-warp barrier surrounding the base, the other to activate the teleportation gate. Once that has been handled, our ground forces stationed in the forest at the base of the mountain will enter the base through the teleportation gate or by warp magic." Hubert pointed to several spots marked on the forested sections of the map, indicating where the ground forces would lie in wait. "I wish to be volunteering for the task of decoy," Petra called out. "I have memory of where the turrets are placed, and how best to be avoiding them." "Are you certain?" Hubert frowned. "Although you were fortunate enough to escape from that encounter largely unscathed, you and your wyvern did sustain some minor injuries. Are you both well enough to fly out again so soon?" "Persephone and I are most well, and have much recovered from our wounds," Petra said sharply, fire blazing in her eyes. "Those turrets have brought much suffering to those I have been flying beside. I promise you, in their names, that I will not be having failure again." "I assure you that your scouting mission was anything but a failure. Nonetheless, I thank you for your assistance." Hubert smiled. "I'll ride with Petra," Dorothea offered with a smile, and a nod at the wyvern lord beside her. "If these turrets are as bad as you say, we'll need some extra firepower to take them out. A meteor or 2 should deal with them." Dorothea added a wink to her last comment. "Yes, big explosions will be much needed." Petra grinned at her companion, with a bright glint in her eyes. "Good thinking," the professor agreed, the smallest traces of a smile tipping the corners of her mouth, a tiny crack in her usual stony expression. "Petra can focus on dodging the turret fire, while Dorothea launches a counterattack." "Excellent. I'll ask Constance and see if she's willing to volunteer as a second flyer," Edelgard suggested. "I know she too has been worried about Ferdinand's whereabouts, and has been offering any assistance she can provide." "I suppose that will do." Hubert bit back a grimace, unable to decide if he dared hope for a sunny or overcast day, noting that both of Constance's shifting moods could land the whole group in disastrous peril. "Might I suggest that Happy accompany her?" The Valkyrie's even-headedness would balance out Constance's more eccentric tendencies. "Sounds good," Edelgard nodded. "I'll send word to them at once." If the decoy roles have been filled, then I volunteer to be part of the infiltration team. Ingrid spoke up, turning her gaze sharply to Hubert. You've seen Duchess and I in combat before. You know we're more than capable. I agree. I can think of no one better suited for such a mission. Hubert nodded. In that case, we will only need one more skilled flyer to infiltrate the base. Though, with our forces stretched thin, we are running low on suitable candidates for such a task. Hubert frowned. It was a shame that Lady Slava had fallen in battle. She would have been perfect for the mission. Actually, Edelgard smirked, a coy lilt to her voice, and a flicker of mischief in her eyes. A couple of talented fighters, including a skilled wyvern lord, have recently arrived and have offered their aid. She nodded to one of the nearby guards to send the aforementioned new arrivals and have them join the meeting. Hubert watched the exchange with a puzzled look. New recruits? He blinked. I was unaware that we had... Hubert's words trailed off, and a rock settled in his stomach as a young man and woman, both who looked far too similar to himself, rounded the corner and entered the cardinal's room. "Hello, brother," Matilda chirped, her face split into a wide, toothy grin. "It appears that you could use some assistance." She slung her bolt-axe over her shoulder, crackles of lightning flickering along the blade, and the sharp scent of ozone clinging to her armor. Theodore hovered slightly behind her, a magic bow and quiver strapped to his back, and waved shyly at the war council. Hubert gaped as he took in the sight of his two younger siblings, before turning to Edelgard with a furious glare. "No!" Hubert snarled. "Absolutely not!" "Hubert, they came here of their own volition." Edelgard sighed, with a stern but empathetic look. "Apparently, the two jumped on Matilda's wyvern and flew straight here as soon as the messengers delivered the news of Ferdinand's disappearance. You're lucky someone needed to stay and attend to Lady Penelope, or else Mother would have been here as well," Matilda huffed. "For that matter, Mother had to practically restrain Lady Penelope from grabbing a levin sword and charging out here herself to go looking for Ferdinand." Hubert slumped against the table, buried his face in his hands, and growled. The icy vines wound around his lungs and squeezed the air from his chest, while searing rivets coursed through his blood. It was bad enough that Ferdinand and Sylvain were in the rotting clutches of the festering worms lurking in the shadows. To think of his younger siblings being ensnared in such a manner. Hubert gnashed his teeth and forced his thoughts away. He forced down a gulp of air that rattled his ribs. Pushing himself away from the table, he fixed his siblings with a dark look. "This is no mere children's game or mock battle," Hubert growled. "We are marching into a nest of vipers, far more nefarious and sadistic than you can possibly imagine. These fiends have been responsible for the torture and death of countless others. Even a single misstep in their presence could be fatal, and not only endanger your own lives, but the lives of those fighting alongside you as well." "We know, Hubert," Theodore snapped. He took a step forward, standing alongside his sister. "We're not children anymore. Matilda and I have been training every day so that we would be able to keep up in battle. We want to help you." Hubert blinked, surprised to see his normally timid brother speak so sharply and stare back at him with such fiery flames flickering in his eyes. The shy veneer melted away, and revealing a young man of fiery, iron resolve. "If you truly do not want them here, I can have them escorted back home," Edelgard spoke in a reassuring voice, but a sad frown curled her mouth downwards. "But they just want to help their brother. How would you feel if you were in their place, knowing their dear sibling puts themselves in danger every day, but being forbidden from assisting in any way they can?" An unpleasant twinge lanced through Hubert. He could feel the eyes of everyone gathered at the war council upon him. As much as he hated to admit it, Lady Edelgard spoke the truth. If his mother, Matilda, or Theodore were ever in danger, no force in all the lands would stop Hubert from going to their aid. Furthermore, his siblings were adults who could follow their own paths and make their own decisions, the same age as many of the soldiers within the Imperial Army, and older than what many of Hubert's companions had been at the start of the war, fresh-faced from the academy as they raised their weapons against the Archbishop for the first time. "So, what's it going to be, Hubert?" Matilda smirked. "You can order us to leave the monastery, but you know full well we will simply follow you once you leave for the rescue mission." Hubert scowled at her words, knowing that, despite their light tone, held no jest as to their intention. His younger brother and sister stared back at him with matching looks of unshakable resolution. Standing from the table, Hubert took a deep breath and stalked towards his siblings. "If I agree to bring the two of you along on this mission, you must both do exactly as I say." Hubert bit out in a low, threatening hiss. "I will brook no room for protest while you are under my command. If I tell you to fall back and retreat, you will do so at once. Do I make myself clear?" "Of course," Theodore chirped with an eager nod.
Yes, yes, we promise not to make a blundering mess of your mission,"
Matilda grumbled.
"In case you didn't notice, we are the most concerned with the safety of Ferdinand and Sylvain as well. After all, Void knows what kind of moping mess you'll be in if something happens to the man you've been pining after."
"You have my thanks for volunteering your aid in such a critical mission. You will be debriefed with further instructions as to your role in the mission shortly." Hubert cut in sharply, with a warning look aimed at his sister, as he pointedly ignored the swaths of heat crawling across his cheeks. He could have sworn he saw Lady Edelgard smirk and cover up a light giggle out of the corner of his eye.
"Good. Buttercup and I will be perfect for the infiltration team Lady Edelgard mentioned."
Matilda smirked. "Theodore can ride with me too, just in case we run into trouble while in the air." Hubert cringed at Matilda's bravado, but nodded in agreeance. At the very least, it would be easier to keep an eye on them if they were under his command. Plus, he had witnessed Matilda's aerial prowess atop a wyvern firsthand during her demonstration at the cottage. She was more than skilled enough to handle the task before her. The plan of infiltrating the base by sky is all well and good, but did you not say these magical devices controlling the barrier and teleportation gate are unlike any technology encountered in Fodland before? Linhart spoke up with a pointed look directed at Hubert. "How's the infiltration team supposed to find these devices, let alone figure out how to use them, if we don't even know what they truly are?" "You raise a good point, Linhart. Most of us wouldn't even know where to begin to look." Edelgard frowned, her brow furrowed, and her mouth pressed into a thin line. Suddenly, her eyes lit up, and she turned to her companion. "Hubert, you should be part of the infiltration team too. You know more about this faction that has abducted Ferdinand and Sylvain, more than anyone else here, and you were the one to identify the use of these devices in the first place. You would have the best chance of locating the device we need to disable." Any color in Hubert's face blanched at the request. Hubert's stomach cartwheeled and tumbled like a rock rolling down a steep hill. Flashes of the Pegasus debacle as a child, as well as the recent hawk incident in the mountains, screeched at his mind. He swallowed heavily, devoting every ounce of willpower to holding the muscles in his face in a neutral position. "That's right, and Hubert can ride with me." Ingrid lit up brightly as she voiced the suggestion, completely oblivious to the panicked screams ringing in the mage's head. Is that wise?" Hubert cleared his throat to cover up the quiver in his voice. "Most Pegasi do not allow men to ride them. It won't do us any good if Duchess becomes infuriated with my presence and throws me from her back from thousands of feet in the air." The sardonic mirth he had forced into his words fell flat. Memories of a terrified child being bucked from a Pegasus and thrown into the sky seared into every corner of his mind. "With the amount of treats and pets you've given Duchess, you could probably fly her into ALL and she wouldn't have a problem." Ingrid smiled. "Besides, I'll be right there with you. You have nothing to worry about." Another wave of cold, feverish dread oozed through his veins like bog water. Lady Edelgard's request for him to take on the mantle of dancer on the battlefield had been bad enough, but the thought of soaring around those mountain tops, the trees below tiny specks of green, while possibly having to maneuver around an onslaught of turret fire if the decoy team was unable to dismantle them, the certainty that he would end up as a gory splat on the rocks below. Hubert would much rather shimmy and twirl through 1,000 battlefields than take to the skies between the mountain tops. Yet, as Lady Edelgard mentioned, Hubert had spent years investigating those who slither in the dark. Although there was so much about the conniving fiends that remained a mystery, he had unearthed enough their intentions, their resources, that even if he did not know exactly what the devices he sought were, he would have the best chance of locating them once inside the base. Besides, Ferdinand and Sylvain were counting on him. A brief flash of unease washed over the professor's face, as her gaze flicked up to Hubert. Hubert hid his clenched hands behind his back to keep them from shaking. "Yes, Lady Edelgard and Ingrid," Hubert responded in a strangled voice he dearly hoped did not sound too shrill. "An excellent suggestion. I shall accompany the infiltration team as well." Matilda turned to Hubert with a frown and a raised eyebrow.
Hubert!"
Matilda grunted and shot a glare at Hubert as he not so subtly elbowed her in the ribs. Thankfully, Lady Edelgard had been preoccupied with speaking with her advisers and had not noticed the exchange between the two siblings. The final points of the meeting were quickly wrapped up. Plans for the ground forces, the Professor, Shamir, Felix, Linhart, Caspar, Bernadetta, and, much to Hubert's distress, Lady Edelgard, were drawn up and put into place. "If that is all, let us prepare to leave at once," Edelgard spoke in a commanding tone. "We cannot afford to delay any longer. Ferdinand and Sylvain's lives hang in the balance. Everyone understands what they are to do. Let's bring our friends home." The sun was just starting to set, the bright lights fading to a blazing orange along the western horizon that burned at their back, the skies before them a swirl of purples and indigos as night swept over the lands. Hubert perched several meters away from the cliff's ledge before him, close enough that he could see the peak of the mountain opposite them, looming ominously through the low clouds like the fang of a massive beast, but not so close as to catch the ground so impossibly far below them. A shaky breath was dragged into his lungs, the air doing little to quell the tremors dancing along his skin and the queasiness churning in his stomach. He clenched his fists once more in a futile attempt to cease their shaking. He tried to focus on the crisp air tickling his face, hoping for the breeze to cool his nerves. All it did was remind Hubert of their distressingly high altitude. Fortunately, they had been able to reach their current location via a footpath winding from the mountains. Hubert could pretend they were merely hiking through a series of steep hills and not partaking in a death march off a blasted cliff. The other members of the infiltration team, Ingrid, Matilda, Theodore, perched at his side. Ingrid crouched at Hubert's left, Matilda and Theodore by his right. Behind them, Hubert could hear the slight rustle of feathers from Duchess's wings, as well as the sail-like flaps of Buttercup's own wingspan. "See anything?" Ingrid whispered. She pointed at the darkening sky with a slight frown. "Not yet," Theodore responded. He thrummed at the string of his magic bow, checking its tension before sliding it on his back once more. "Keep your eyes peeled. The decoy team should be striking soon." Hubert warned them in a firm tone that miraculously managed to mask most of the shakiness in his voice. Matilda glanced at him with a smirk and a raised eyebrow. "You're not going to empty the contents of your stomach already, are you?" she quipped. "The contents of my stomach will not be an issue," Hubert growled, even as his stomach performed a cartwheel to empathize the contrary. "Now, focus on the task at hand." "Wait," Ingrid frowned, her eyes jumping between the Vestra siblings and the cliff ledge, before sending a sharp look at Hubert. "Are you afraid of heights?" Hubert winced at the blunt comment and forced his face into a veneer of cold neutrality. I do not know if afraid is the term I would use to define my mild apprehension of—
"He's right. Mortified is a much better descriptor of how he is around anything higher than a horse,"
Matilda cut off with an impish smirk. "My perfectly reasonable caution concerning heights is of no matter," Hubert snapped. "We have a mission to fulfill, and the lives of our companions are at stake. Now, if we are done, might I suggest we return our attention to the skies? We will only have a short opening to infiltrate the base once Petra and the others launch their attack, lest we risk reinforcements descending upon our location." Ingrid quietly stared back at him, a furrow crinkling her brow. "Are you going to be okay to do this?" she frowned. "Your concern is appreciated, but I assure it is not necessary." An explosion roared through the sky. A bright eruption of flames accompanied the booming sound and blazed across the sky. Everyone's eyes jumped to the mountain peak at the other side of the valley, the summit wreathed in fire and simmering like a volcano. If Hubert squinted, he could see the shadowy outline of a wyvern flapping around the mountain peak like a massive bat. Immediately, a barrage of bright lights ripped through the air, trying to attack the flying beast's movements. It would seem as if Petra and Dorothea had begun the assault. Hubert turned sharply to his companions. "Everyone, to your places, and prepare to fly at once." Matilda and Theodore nodded, and mounted Buttercup without another word. The massive wyvern unfurled her burgundy wings and prepared to take to the skies. Nearby, Ingrid waited patiently atop Duchess for Hubert to join her. She watched him with a worried frown as he clumsily clambered atop the Pegasus's back and settled in place behind Ingrid. "Hang on tight," Ingrid advised him, shooting the mage a worried glance over her shoulder. "Yes, yes," Hubert muttered as he wrapped his arms around the falcon knight before him. "Let's be off." Ingrid nodded and ushered Duchess forward with the flick of her reins. The Pegasus unfurled her wings and launched herself forward. Hubert held his breath and squeezed his eyes shut as the Pegasus's hoofbeats reached the edge of the cliff and descended beyond. Weightlessness slammed into him, Hubert's stomach feeling as if it plummeted to his feet as the wind caught Duchess's wings and they lifted into the air. As a child, looking up at the sky and watching the Pegasus knights dance among the clouds, graceful like a flock of ethereal doves, he had believed that there could be no feeling more magnificent. To glide along the winds, to reach out a hand to touch the clouds, as he beheld the splendor of the land stretched out far beneath him, a sight more breathtaking than the grandest of scenic paintings. He had dreamed of soaring through the skies on the wings of a Pegasus, just as his mother had, just like the falcon knights he had watched from the windows. Now, with that dream a reality, all his body wanted to do was throw up and pass out. Hubert scrunched down and tucked his head behind Ingrid. Wind whipped past his face in frosty blades, the sound near deafening against his ears. The queasiness that had simmered in his gut roiled to a boil that threatened to spill over. He forced his gaze to remain locked onto the mountain before him. Just don't look down, and everything will be fine. The air was too cold, the feeling in his body too weightless, and they were too damn high. Hubert's heart scratched and pounded against his chest until he felt as if his ribs would splinter. His eyes drifted to the ground for a split second. The world tilted sideways, and he could feel black spots blooming across his vision. He shook his head and growled, forcing down cold barbs of terror that latched onto his nerves. Nearby, he could hear the heavy wing beats of Matilda flying her wyvern alongside them, the Vestra sister cackling with delight as she soared along the chilly gusts. A crack of lightning tore through the air and slammed into the mountain peak they were flying towards, one of Constance's bolting spells. Razored lights swiveled and fired in another direction, tracking the trajectory of the dark flyer. Soon after, a hurricane of black and crimson wind swirled across part of the peak, a Hades spell cast by Happy. The shower of enemy fire went still, as the slicing winds of the dark magic spell washed over the Viscum turret. "Doing okay back there, Hubert?" Ingrid shouted over the harsh winds, ripping at his ears. "Fine. Just fine," he managed to choke out between panicked gulps of air that did nothing but scrape his trachea and burn his lungs, as if molten sand were being poured down his throat. Blades of light ripped in their direction. One of the Viscum turrets had locked onto them. Ingrid tugged at Duchess's reins, sharply pulling her Pegasus to the side to dodge the attack. Hubert yelped and buried his face in Ingrid's back. His arms tightened like manacles around the rider sitting before him. "Hubert!" Ingrid wheezed and tapped at his constricting arms. "I can't breathe!" Another pathetic whimper slipped from his mouth as Ingrid was forced to careen away from another hail of turret fire. Gritting his teeth until the chalky taste of ground enamel filled his mouth, he forced his arms to loosen their hold on Ingrid. Ferdinand and Sylvain were counting on him. He would not descend into cowardice while their lives were in danger. Another explosion burst through the sky. Another turret cracked as it was reduced to sparks by Dorothea's meteor attacks. Nearby, Hubert heard Matilda growl with fury as she and Buttercup evaded an energy blast fired in her direction. The mountain loomed closer, almost near enough to reach out and touch. The hidden doors to the base, composed of an unusual type of metal, within Hubert's sight. Hubert took a deep breath, his eyes locked onto the ledge before them, the solid ground that would soon be under Hubert's feet once more, and the entrance to the fortress he desperately hoped held his dear companions. They were almost there. Duchess had just been about to make her descent onto the ledge, when the door to the base swung open. 4 robed acolytes streamed onto the ledge like a swarm of leeches, purple swirls of dark magic readied at their fingertips. Screaming the words to the incantation, Hubert summoned a deluge of mire on top of 2 of the fiends. The mages shrieked as they struggled to scrape the corrosive sludge from their robes. Pungent steam wafted from the fiends, as mire burned through the fabric and flesh alike. Atop her wyvern, Matilda screeched past them, bolt-axe in hand, and charged another dark mage with a fierce battle-cry. Lightning danced atop the blade as she brought down her axe on the chest of the nearest fiend. She wrenched the weapon free as Buttercup swept past and circled around through the air in a gliding loop. Ingrid set her sights on the final acolyte. A red glow emanated from the relic, as the crest stone embedded within responded to Ingrid's blood. The crest of Daphne surged to life in an explosion of light. With Loon gripped in her hand, she ushered Duchess forward and charged at the fiend like an arrow loosed from its bow. The lance drove into the gut of the final fiend. The spell they had been brewing silenced as they squawked and pawed at the blade buried just below their ribs. The acolyte slumped to the ground dead, when Ingrid ripped her lance free. As Ingrid guided Duchess in for a landing, the 5th acolyte, this one garbed in dark bishop robes and a bird mask, burst through the entrance, with the purple clouds of a death spell swirling in their hands. An arrow coated in ice magic spiraled through the air and struck the fiend in the neck. The death spell faded and dissipated, and the dark bishop clutched at their bleeding throat and collapsed to the ground with a gurgling sound. Seconds later, the wretch went still. Hubert scrambled from Duchess's back, nearly toppling off the Pegasus in the process. His legs wobbled. A bubble of hysterical laughter almost burst from his chest. He doubled over, head bowed down by his knees, and dragged in luxurious gulps of air as his heartbeat slowly returned to a normal cadence. Never before had the ground beneath his feet been so glorious. Matilda landed Buttercup on the ledge next to Duchess. Behind her, Theodore sat with his bow still drawn, face pale and panting. He shot a worried look at Hubert and Ingrid, but instantly brightened when he noticed they were both okay.
"Well, that was quite the adventure," Matilda chirped as she clapped her older brother on the shoulder.
"Yes, let us never repeat it again," Hubert grumbled, with his head still tucked down by his knees. Theodore went to his side and placed a comforting hand on his hunched, quaking back. While Hubert caught his breath, Ingrid and Matilda sent their respective steeds away, the Pegasus and Wyvern taking shelter on another cliff ledge from the mountain beside them. The sounds of lightning bolts and crashing meteors overhead reverberated and shook the mountain top, a cascade of dirt flowing from the rocky ceiling overhead. Hubert drifted towards the doors that barred their entrance to the base. Metal, smooth like obsidian glass, and as cold as ice, stretched before him. He pressed at the doors, growling when they refused to budge. A strange mechanism of glowing lights, arranged in a circular pattern of glyphs, rested at the center of the gate. Likely, the mechanism opened and closed the doors. Tentatively, he poked at the lights. A tingle of electricity danced along Hubert's arm, the blue lights changing to a paler white under his touch. He could feel the eyes of his companions watching curiously over his shoulder. After a moment of fiddling with the mechanism, the metal door slid open. A darkened corridor framed in eerie, neon lights greeted Hubert's eyes. The walls, the floor, everything, were forged of the same strange metal the doors had been composed of. Glowing strips of iridescent lighting coursed along the walls and ceilings, like the arteries of a giant beast. The color, searingly bright, and unlike anything seen in the natural world, it illuminated the dark halls in a spectral shimmer. "So, we going in?" Ingrid gulped, as she stared at the gaping chasm before them. Hubert stared at the abyss of shadow and eldritch lights. tomb-like silence emanated from the corridor. Only the strange hum of the lights buzzed in his ears. Every instinct and nerve in Hubert's body screamed at him to run. He doubted that this was the fiend's main base, but the hidden fortress before him was still larger than any of the maggot's encampments he had encountered in the past. There was no telling what lay on the other side. But there was no way Hubert was going to abandon Ferdinand and Sylvain to their fate. He would march through the gates of the underworld itself to save them. Hubert nodded sternly to his companions. "Remember, we have no idea of their numbers. There may very well be a small army between us and our captive companions. Our first priority is to locate the apparatus for the barrier and teleportation gate, so that the others may join us. Do not let your guard down for even a moment." The others nodded their assent. With a final check of their equipment, the small group crept their way inside. It did not matter if Hubert had to tear the whole mountain apart. He was going to find Ferdinand and Sylvain.